Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of History's Greatest Battles. As always, if you know somebody that would enjoy this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. Today is continuation of our experimental episode on the life and battlefield times of Jan Zizhka. This is episode 2 of a 3-part experimental series. As we approach the end of season 1, which will end at about 85 or 90 episodes, we're going to move on to season 2, whereas yesterday I mentioned that I have a series of topics to cover, roughly 50 fascinating sieges, a dozen or so deep dives like today's episode on incredible military commanders throughout history, and individual stories of heroism on the battlefield. And so in an attempt to figure out what would be most fascinating, I'm doing this experimental 3-part series, deep diving into the life and battlefield times of Jan Zizhka. If you haven't listened to episode 1 yet, please go back and start there, unless of course you prefer to start midway in the story. Let's now experience the life and times of Jan Zizhka.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, experimental episode of Season 2, Episode 1, The Life and Times of Jan Zizhka, birth, guessed at around 1360, common era to his death in 1424. Jan Zizhka was a relentless warrior who defied every convention of his time. Born in a Bohemian village, he rose from the ranks of minor nobility to become the most feared general in Central Europe, fighting without sight in one eye, and later completely blind. Zhizhka led his peasant army against the might of the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church, commanding with a precision and brutality that shattered the knight's traditional dominance. His brilliance lay in his unbreakable discipline, iron-willed strategy, and mastery of the wagenburg, his mobile fortress of fortified wagons and firepower that turned common men into deadly soldiers. Even his enemies feared him as a military genius who never lost a battle. Zhizhka's life was a testament to raw resilience and tactical supremacy. His legacy a reminder that true strength lies in the unyielding will to fight for what one believes is right, no matter the odds. If you missed yesterday's episode, here is a brief overview. Jan Zizka's early life remains shrouded in mystery, yet his ascent as a military leader during the Hussite Wars positioned him as a formidable figure in medieval warfare. Born into a modestly noble Bohemian family, Zizka's trajectory shifted following the religious and nationalist stirrings led by reformer Jan Hus, who defied the Catholic Church's authority. After Hus's execution in 1415, tensions in Bohemia intensified, driving Zizka and other radical Hussites to form a determined military resistance against royal and church authorities. When Pope Martin V issued a crusade against the Hussites in 1420, Zizka rapidly distinguished himself by developing a unique mobile defensive strategy centered around wagenburg wagon fort formations. These war wagons, fortified and armed with crossbowmen, handgunners, and the early use of cannon, proved especially effective against heavily armored royalist cavalry. His force's discipline and Zizka's innovative tactics challenged the cavalry-dominated norms of European combat, leading to decisive victories that cemented his leadership and turned the Hussite cause into a symbol of Bohemian resilience. Zizka's adaptive approach to warfare, leveraging the terrain, religious zeal, and skills of a largely peasant force, allowed him to hold against numerically superior opponents. At the Battle of Sudemer and later engagements, he capitalized on the Hussites' use of gunpowder weapons, creating a significant psychological and tactical advantage that disrupted the traditional battlefield power dynamics. His methods reflected an early form of combined arms strategy, integrating missile troops, infantry, and fortified mobile positions in a coordinated defense. Zizka's emphasis on maneuverable fortifications and close-range firepower ultimately redefined medieval siege and field warfare. His legacy endures in military history as a pioneer of innovative defensive tactics, underscoring the profound impact of adaptable strategies and resourceful command on the battlefield.
The soldiers got a taste of real combat early on when Zhizhka led a dawn assault on the nearby town of Wozice. Nicholas Devoki, one of Zhizhka's foes from Sudemer, held the town and its castle. The surprise attack drove the defenders into the castle, allowing Zhizhka's men to seize horses, weapons, and prisoners, whom they later exchanged for 30 captured Taborites. This raid gave Zhizhka the core of a cavalry unit, capable of counterattacks in battle and reconnaissance on the march. On May 16th, news came of a royalist threat in Prague, and within 48 hours, Zhizhka had his army on the march. Leading a force of 9,000 strong, 5,000 infantry, a few hundred cavalry, and a column of war and supply wagons, Zhizhka set his sights on Prague. They covered 50 miles on their first day, clashing with a 400-strong royalist cavalry force at Bienisov, which they drove off in short order. South of Prague, the Hussites met a three-pronged royalist force numbering 13,000 bearing down on them near the village of Porchy. Zizka set up his wagenburg on a hill and repelled the assault, inflicting around 50 casualties. It was enough to convince the Italian mercenary commander to order a retreat. On May the 21st, the Hussite force marched triumphantly into Prague. Zhizhka wasted no time fortifying the southern moat facing Vyšehrad Fort and launching a siege against Hradčany Castle. Sigismund, stationed at Kutna Hora, appeared frozen with indecision. He only feinted at Prague, just enough to divert Zhizhka while he slipped supply wagons into Hradčany Castle, but he wouldn't commit to a fight. At last, Zhizhka abandoned the siege and focused on bolstering Prague's defenses. Meanwhile, Sigismund, having failed to take both Tabor and Hradec Králové, set his sights on Prague again in mid-July 1420. Recognizing the threat of a siege, Zhizhka knew he had to secure the last open road to Prague, the route eastward over Vítkov Hill, overlooking the Vltava's southern bank. He commanded the hilltop to be fortified at once. Sigismund's massive force, 80,000 men strong, arrived from across the empire. Warriors from 33 principalities in nearly every corner of Europe, save Scandinavia. His army fielded more infantry than cavalry, around 45,000 foot soldiers to 35,000 mounted, and the majority were hired mercenaries. Sigismund's army camped on the northern heights above the Vltava, dominating the old town. With Vyšehrad and the lesser town also in royalist hands, the Hussites found themselves nearly encircled. Vítkov Hill slopes were stripped of cover. At its western ridge stood an ancient watchtower. Zhizhka had the watchtower reinforced and a rampart-backed ditch carved across the 100-yard hilltop, with towers anchoring each end of the embankment. Each flanking position could hold no more than 30 men, but Zhizhka was confident he'd have time to reinforce before the enemy attack began. He miscalculated. Sigismund had planned a two-pronged diversion. On July 14th, one force struck from Hradčany, classing at the Charles Bridge, while a second swept out of Vyšehrad to hit Prague's southern flank. Once both diversions were in motion, Sigismund deployed 7,000 to 8,000 cavalry across the eastern bend of the Vltava, where the river curved north. From there, they could storm Vítkov Hill along a gentler slope, with orders to charge straight for the ridgeline. The cavalry weren't spotted until they'd crossed the river, and Zhizhka scrambled to send reinforcements to the hilltop. Until help arrived, the small band of defenders braced behind their parapet, prepared to hold out no matter the cost. The terrain played to the Hussites' advantage, funneling the attackers into a narrow path, just as the dike had done at Sudomer. Thousands of cavalry could only advance in tight ranks, cramming their assault into a 100-yard front. The ditch slowed their momentum, forcing some knights to dismount and slog through on foot. From behind their parapets, the unarmored Hussite peasants used their agility to strike with flails, while archers rained arrows from the towers. Zhizhka himself led a small detachment to the hill's western end, bringing much-needed relief to his embattled troops. At the same time, he dispatched a larger force of Taborites and Prague soldiers up the road to the east, with orders to strike at the enemy's exposed flank. Hayman captures Zhizhka's intervention. Quote, "Finding the situation critical, he threw himself into the fight, trying to hold the remaining bulwark with his little troop at all costs and at the risk of his own life. From this moment till the arrival of the larger Taborite force, there was only a short interval, but this was the military and psychological crisis of the battle." End quote. The enemy, fixated on Zhizhka's position, was blindsided by the flank assault. It was a classic Taborite advance, led by a priest bearing the host, followed by archers, with peasants in the rear, wielding flails and spiked weapons. The knights were caught off guard. They broke formation and fled down the steep hillside. In their frantic retreat, they may have suffered greater losses than in the clash itself, up to 500 men. The reserve force of Hussites charged out from the Porcini Gate, chasing the imperial troops across Hospital Field. Though the royalists mounted no further attacks, Zhizhka still reinforced the defenses. He had fortified Vitkov Hill well in advance, strengthening old defenses and building new ones. But Zhizhka understood the need for security. The imperial forces hit with alarming speed, catching an undermanned garrison off guard and forcing them to defend with minimal support. Fortunately, the defenses held firm, and the rugged terrain favored the defenders. With an unbreakable resolve, Zhizhka struck back, drawing enough reinforcements to pin down the attackers and secure his lines. Though the pace of the battle was beyond his control, his counterpunch held the enemy in place. As the clash continued along the western ridge, few saw the flanking force maneuvering into position. Hidden by the slope, safely out of sight of the royalist camp, their advance was perfectly concealed. The surprise assault was decisive, leveling the imbalance in numbers. With a mere 3,000 soldiers, Zhizhka's men unleashed a counterattack that shattered the royalist ranks. Pursuing them further would have been madness. It would have meant chasing retreating troops across the Vltava and straight into the imperial camp. Though Sigismund's losses were small, the impact was enough to spark discontent and lead to the first wave of desertions. The scorching summer heat and outbreaks of disease tore through Sigismund's ranks, further eroding morale. With Sigismund paralyzed by indecision, rumors spread like wildfire through the camp, with whispers that he was in league with the very Hussites themselves. Watching his army unravel, Sigismund turned to politics. He retreated to Hradčany Castle, where he had himself crowned King of Bohemia at St. Vitus Cathedral. But it was a hollow ceremony. He had envisioned triumph, crowned by a decisive victory. Abandoning the siege, he withdrew his remaining 16,000 troops to Kutna Hora, determined to secure the silver mines if he could hold nothing else. Though practical, these actions paled next to the staggering morale boost the Hussites gained by holding their ground in Prague and forcing Sigismund's retreat. The Hussites secured another victory before year's end, but Sigismund was relentless. By winter, he had assembled a fresh army, poised once more outside Prague. Once again, the Taborites rushed to Prague's aid. In a decisive clash below Vyšehrad Castle, they clinched a victory on November 1st, 1420, saving both the city and the Hussite cause. A few months later, Hradčany Castle and Prague's western quarter were firmly in Hussite hands. In the latter half of 1420, Zhizhka found himself in battle not just with royalists, but with factions within the Hussite ranks. Among Bohemia's poorest, Huss's teachings sparked radical visions, beliefs that a fully equal society would usher in Christ's return. The middle class and lesser nobles resisted these ideas, more for economic reasons than for spiritual ones. Zhizhka himself, from the burgher class, relied heavily on city support. Those who rallied behind the most radical priests soon found themselves beaten back, their uprisings crushed. While some survivors drifted to fringe settlements, the majority, peasants and townsfolk alike, saw that any hope of real change lay in following Zhizhka. Tabor remained a bastion of radicalism, but it was the middle class that controlled the town's affairs. By early 1421, Zhizhka stood unchallenged as the commander-in-chief of Hussite forces, both within Tabor and beyond. In early 1421, Sigismund pulled his forces out of Bohemia, retreating to Germany. This withdrawal bought the Hussites time to handle internal conflicts and marked the end of the First Crusade against them. With the Crusaders gone, the Hussites seized the chance to expand their influence. They attacked town after town, sometimes laying siege for days, sometimes for months. During one of these sieges, Zhizhka took a critical wound, leading the charge against the town of Rabi, near the Hussite city of Tachov. He was struck in the face by an arrow. The arrow cost him his remaining eye and nearly his life. But after weeks of recovery in Prague, he emerged with his health restored, though now completely blind. Yet blindness proved no hindrance. Zhizhka went on to lead some of his most formidable battles and campaigns without the use of sight. Reputation alone could have sustained him, but his skill as a leader remained as sharp as ever. By late July, Zhizhka's name alone struck fear across the land. Even so, German forces from Meissen managed to cross the border and lift the Hussite siege of Most. In August, the Hussite forces in Prague regrouped under Zhizhka's command and marched to confront the advancing vanguard of the Second Crusade. Upon hearing that Zhizhka himself was marching toward them, still recovering from his wounds, the German forces chose to retreat rather than meet him in battle. The Second Crusade was even larger than the first, with estimates between 120,000 and 200,000 soldiers. The Crusaders came with brutal orders to spare only young children among the Czechs. The first crusading force moved east from the Upper Palatinate, passing through Cheb en route to the Hussite stronghold of Zetek. Another force struck from Meissen in a three-pronged advance, seizing towns northwest of Prague before merging with the main army. Zetek quickly came under siege but repelled 6 major assaults. Morale among the Crusaders crumbled from repeated failures and Hussite counterattacks. And it worsened further on October the 2nd when word came that Zhizhka's forces were closing in. The news was all it took for the Germans to abandon their siege and retreat. Adding to their misfortunes, a fire erupted in their tent city just as they prepared to withdraw. The Hussite defenders seized the moment, launching a sortie that left heavy casualties in their wake. Around 2,000 Crusaders lay dead. This stinging defeat struck before Sigismund's forces even entered the field, casting a grim shadow over the Second Crusade. A third southern offensive kept Zhizhka occupied through the autumn of 1421. Meanwhile, Sigismund was finally mobilizing his offensive. A Hungarian force of 60,000 troops with 23,000 cavalry advanced into Moravia under the command of Philip Scolari, better known as Pippo Spano, the Italian mercenary general. Sigismund joined Spano in late October at Jihlava, near the Moravian-Bohemian border. But instead of pressing on to retake Kutna Hora and its valuable mint, Sigismund's old habit of hesitating took hold. He waited for additional reinforcements. This delay allowed Zhizhka's 12,000-strong force to reach Kutna Hora first, arriving on December the 9th and fortifying the city's defenses. It took the imperial forces a full 20 days to cover the mere 50 miles from Jihlava to Kutna Hora. As Heyman recounts, quote, "All the time Sigismund's Hungarians destroyed Czech villages, burned the men, mutilated the boys, raped the women and girls. The behavior of his troops was so atrocious that not one of the Czech chronicles which describes this invasion omits reference to it." End quote. Sigismund and Scolari reached Kutna Hora on December the 21st. As the 50,000-strong imperial army neared, Zhizhka formed his wagenburg before the city walls, creating a line long enough to guard both western roads leading into Kutna Hora. Scolari, commanding the operation, arranged his cavalry in a thin line opposite Zhizhka's wagons and launched attack after attack throughout the day. The Hussite cannons cut down their ranks, yet the relentless assault held the Hussites' attention to the west. Scolari and Sigismund, knowing Kutna Hora's German-speaking citizens leaned pro-imperial, had secretly reached out to their leaders. While the battle roared beyond the walls, an imperial cavalry unit maneuvered south and reached the Malosov Gate. Their conspirators within opened it for them. The small garrison Zhizhka had stationed inside was swiftly overrun, leaving the Hussites trapped and surrounded. Zhizhka now faced the gravest threat of his career, but his unbreakable resolve and tactical mind never wavered. Sigismund, seeking to enter Kutna Hora only in a show of victory, remained at his headquarters on the imperial left flank. At dawn, Zhizhka conceived a daring plan, a surprise assault on Sigismund's own headquarters. Once again, Zhizhka's understanding of his foe proved invaluable. He knew Sigismund always stayed behind the lines, far from any personal risk. Zhizhka counted on this, knowing Sigismund's first instinct would be to protect himself, not lead a counterattack. Before first light on December the 22nd, Zhizhka lined up his wagons and unleashed cannon fire directly at Sigismund's command post. The sudden roar of gunfire in the dark sent shockwaves through the imperial camp, throwing Sigismund's men into chaos, just as Zhizhka intended. The column halted at intervals to reload and fire, keeping pressure on the defenders. The bombardment tore open a path through their lines, giving the Hussites a way to escape. The night attack proved the perfect choice. Such a move in daylight would likely have failed. By dawn, the Hussite wagons had vanished, safely positioned on a hill about a mile away, where Zhizhka set up in case of a pursuit that never materialized. Confident the coast was clear, Zhizhka marched his forces to Kolin, where he spent the next 2 weeks rallying reinforcements from the surrounding region. Meanwhile, Sigismund, believing the Hussites were in full retreat, settled himself comfortably in Kutna-Hora, assuming he'd have peace until spring. With too many troops to house in Kutna-Hora, he scattered them in nearby villages, especially around Kaslov, a Hussite stronghold to the east, and Nebovidi midway to Kolin as a protective buffer. Zhizhka seized this opportunity. On January 6th, he struck the imperial troops at Nebovidi, catching them completely off guard. The specifics of these next few battles remain vague, but it's clear that the Hussites attacked and the imperial troops crumbled. A 19th century account, likely from George Sand's biography of Zhizhka, describes this scene as follows, quote, Zhizhka suddenly burst upon Sigismund's scattered troops like a thunderbolt. Hundreds of Hungarians were cut down at the first onslaught, and the panic spread with awful rapidity from village to village, end quote. What mattered was the outcome. The Crusaders fled back toward Kutna-Hora in a frenzy, spreading panic that reached deep into Sigismund's heart. Desperate, Sigismund pleaded with the Germantown elders to defend Kutna-Hora against Zhizhka's advancing forces, but when they hesitated, he ordered the city set ablaze, rather than let it fall into Hussite control. Kutna-Hora's citizens were hurried out of the town with little warning, as a Hungarian cavalry unit stayed behind to ignite the flames. But their greed for loot and the pace of Zhizhka's pursuit meant that only a handful of fires were lit, and those were swiftly extinguished. The pursuit pressed on, intensifying the panic. Sigismund chose to make his next stand a few miles southwest at Habri. His advisors, including Scolari, warned against it. His troops were too shaken to hold their ground. The advisors were right, but Sigismund ignored them. When Zhizhka's Hussites attacked, the defenders once again broke and ran. The rout was absolute. Crusaders abandoned everything but their weapons in their frantic retreat. Sigismund made a hasty escape toward Jilava on the Moravian border, crossing the Sazava River at Nemeski Brod, far ahead of his own troops. Some of his soldiers attempted a stand, but Zhizhka's relentless pursuit drove them into a desperate scramble over the frozen river. Yet the river wasn't fully frozen, and as the ice cracked beneath their weight, an estimated 548 knights drowned. A rushed defense of the town crumbled quickly under the relentless fire of Hussite artillery, which tore through the walls. Negotiations for surrender unraveled when a Hussite patrol spotted a weak section of the wall, breached it without waiting for orders, and reignited the battle. Following the Hussite victory and the chaos that followed, Zhizhka established one of history's earliest codes of war, laying out strict rules for his troops in battle and beyond, a discipline few armies of the time possessed. The battles from January 6th to the 9th of 1422 claimed at least 4,500 imperial lives. The Hussite losses remain unrecorded, though they are believed to have been minimal. From Kutna-Hora to Nemeski Brod, this campaign displayed Zhizhka's full prowess in both offense and defense. Given days to prepare his wagenburg outside Kutna-Hora, Zhizhka's fortified wagons inflicted severe losses on the imperial cavalry. When the townsfolk's betrayal left him cut off, Zhizhka focused his firepower and force against a single weak point, the king's very headquarters, unleashing a barrage that shattered the enemy's morale and cleared his escape. Exploiting his enemy's premature confidence and Sigismund's reluctance for a direct engagement, Zhizhka launched his January 6th offensive, embodying every principle of attack: surprise, concentrated force, control of tempo, and sheer boldness. From the initial engagement, Zhizhka launched a precise strike, then pressed forward with a swift exploitation and relentless pursuit over long distances. The feat is astounding. A blind general orchestrating an escape from encirclement, then leading a relentless chase across winter-ravaged terrain against a broken enemy. This was no ordinary medieval warfare. On the grand strategic stage, the campaign held immense importance. It brought an end to the Second Crusade and left Sigismund so defeated that he avoided Bohemia for years. Remaining in Hungary and leaving future crusades to the German princes, Sigismund spared Bohemia the strain of a two-front war. The fierce reputation of Zhizhka and his followers would prove decisive in the next 3 crusades launched in the coming years. One crusading force barely set foot in Bohemia before the sound of Hussite soldiers singing Zhizhka's war songs drove them back in terror without a single clash. Historian Hans Delbruck observes, quote, "Once the warlike character had gained the upper hand and had become completely dominant, the Hussites were preceded by a wave of fear, so that the Germans dispersed before them whenever they simply heard their battle song from afar." End quote. Yet it was internal feuds, not invasions, that ultimately undermined the Hussite cause.
Thus ends episode 2 of a 3-part series on Jan Zhizhka, his life, and his battlefield times.